You're listening to the Full and Thriving Podcast, a place where courageous women come to break free from food obsession, heal their relationship with their body, and strive to live a life that's present, lighthearted, and meaningful. If you're listening, my wish is that this podcast serves as a catalyst that inspires you to nourish your body, nurture your mind, and energize your spirit. I'm your host, Meg McCabe, a certified life coach and eating disorder recovery coach with a PhD in having a good time. Just kidding about that last part. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show. Today's guest is Dr. Heather Finley. Dr. Heather is a registered dietitian who helps people struggling with bloating, constipation, and IBS find relief from their symptoms and feel excited about food again. Dr. Heather struggled with her own digestive issues for nearly 20 years and understands firsthand the impact that nutrition, lifestyle, and mindset have on digestive health. Dr. Heather has a doctorate in clinical nutrition from Maryland University of Integrative Health, and her work has been featured on Good Morning Texas and in Mind Body Green, Yahoo Life, and Very Well Health. Together, we discuss the most common GI symptoms of folks with eating disorders, the science behind them, and how to start your digestive healing journey in recovery. I know that this topic is super important to so many folks listening, and I also know that this is going to be a very helpful episode for you. So with that, I hope you enjoy this episode of the show. Hello, Dr. Finley. How are you this morning?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here. We haven't done many episodes on digestive health and gut health and healing, and I know that this is a topic that so many listeners are desperate to hear, so I cannot wait to dive in with you today.
Well, I'm really excited. You know, I could talk about digestive health all day long, so we'll hit all the hot topics.
Fabulous. I'm so excited. Before we dive into healing your digestion and gut health in general, I'd love it if you could please share about your background and your 20-year experience with digestive issues, because I know that this is what sparked your career path. Pretty intertwined.
Yes, definitely intertwined. And I always tell people I was born constipated. And I don't say that to be like, doom and gloom or anything like that. But truly, I don't remember a time as a child not being constipated. And to be honest, I didn't actually really recognize that I had a problem because I had always felt that way. So I thought everybody probably just felt the same way that I did. And in my early teenage years, I finally realized, maybe not everybody is super constipated and spends, hours on the toilet or has stomach cramps or feels scared to eat because of their stomach pain, etc. And it was kind of shocking to me because I'm like, oh, wow, I had no idea that people don't feel this way. So started talking to my parents about it. They sent me to all these different doctors, and pretty much the recommendations were just take Miralax or just eat more fiber, drink more water. And I always was a really great eater as a kid. I liked a lot of different foods. I ate plenty of fiber. I was an athlete, so I drank tons of water. And those recommendations were not super helpful because I was like, I'm already doing these things. I actually had pretty severe headaches as a kid as well. Now I know as a result of my digestive issues, and the doctor's recommendation was, well, just take an ibuprofen every day to prevent the headaches. And even as a teenager, I'm like, that can't be good for you, right? Like that can't be the solution. And so, as I mentioned, I was an athlete. I was a swimmer most of my life and in college. And in high school, as I was deciding what I wanted to study, I didn't even know that you could study nutrition until one day on the pool deck, we actually had a dietitian come and speak to us about sports nutrition. And I came home and I told my mom, I said, that is the coolest job. That's what I want to do. And so always thought I wanted to be a teacher, but pivoted my plan, went to study nutrition. And to be honest, a lot of it was really selfish. I really wanted to know what I could eat to swim the fastest. And I also wanted to know how to fix my own digestive issues. So off I go to college, start this nutrition program, and I'm swimming in college, and my GI issues were at their worst. Now looking back, I know why. I was a college student who didn't sleep. I was severely overtrained. We were training 20, 25 hours a week as college athletes, and it was a lot. And on top of that, I also had these digestive issues, which I do think now, looking back as well, prevented me from eating enough to fuel myself as an athlete. But it was not something that I even really noticed and that I was aware of. And so sent me kind of on this journey. I graduated school, still had really bad digestive issues, and kind of felt like a fraud. I was thinking, I just spent 4 years and however much money studying nutrition, and I can't even fix myself. How am I going to help other patients? Thought I had chosen the wrong career. Ended up getting a job as a clinical dietitian at a hospital. And long story short, was introduced to functional nutrition. And that's when I really started to learn a lot more about digestion, and had so many light bulb moments thinking, why were we never taught this in school? I seriously have no idea why no one ever told me about the gut-brain connection, or about how stress and sleep and all these other things affect my digestion. I thought for so long my digestive issues were caused by what I was eating, but it was actually caused by a lot of what I wasn't eating and how I was operating my life. Like I mentioned, I was severely overtrained. I was the person who always was like, I'll sleep when I'm dead. That's not, sleep is for the birds. I was waking up at 5 a.m. to train, even after I was retired from swimming. And throughout that program, it truly changed my life, because I realized so much more about the body and biochemistry and physiology, and how your digestive issues are so much more than what you're eating. As I mentioned, it's so much about what you aren't and what you aren't including, and including all the other lifestyle factors. So I made it my mission in those moments in that program to prevent other people from having to go get a doctorate to figure out their digestive issues. And so here I am now. It's been a journey, but it's safe to say that that experience really now has become my life's work and my passion to bring awareness to digestive issues, and also to help people find relief from their digestive issues without messing with their relationship with food, and with being able to live their life the way that they want.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing all of that. When you were going through it yourself, you mentioned that you noticed you might not have been eating as much as you thought you were. How did your digestive issues impact your relationship with food?
In a lot of ways, my digestive issues made me feel full sooner than I probably was, and what I perceived as full. Most likely that was gas and bloating as a result of the digestive issues. But, it was to the point where I was really scared to eat at certain times of the day, knowing, oh, I have to wear these pants, or I have to do this thing later. And so it really impacted me in a lot of ways, and also affected my relationships with friends and even boyfriends as well. Like, knowing, okay, I'm going on a date later. I have this thing. I can't eat these foods because otherwise my stomach is going to hurt. And so I spent a lot of years making decisions around food, when the reality was there was so much more to my digestive issues than just avoiding food.
Oh my gosh. I feel like what you're saying is so relatable, because it was really impacting your social life, and your mental health. And it sounds like you were constantly seeking solutions, but couldn't really find the right fit for you.
No, I couldn't. And I felt like I was going in circles, and almost like I was on the teacups at Disneyland. Like, how can I get off of this? But like, they won't stop spinning. And so it just felt like the spiral of constantly trying to prevent these symptoms, but then as a result, the stress of that making the symptoms even worse, and just the backlash of all of that. I was running way too much to try to control my bloating, ended up with like stress fractures from running too much, and probably being severely undernourished and just so many things. So yeah, it affected relationships. It affected my career in some sense. I was exhausted throughout the day at work, and it really started to have an impact on other people besides just me.
Wow. And you mentioned you discovered functional nutrition and that changed everything. Could you explain what exactly functional nutrition is? And also how you were able to, like the aha moments you had that helped support your healing once you kind of were opened up to this world.
Yeah. So functional nutrition is looking at how the body all works together. In our current conventional medical system, we're looking to address symptoms, right? You have a headache, you take this medication. You have this thing, you take this thing, versus looking at what's the cause of the symptom? Why are you having these headaches, or why are you having bloating, versus you are bloated, so just avoid these foods and then you won't be bloated. We're looking at the cause. Maybe you have low stomach acid. Maybe you're not digesting food well. Maybe your gut motility is off. And so with functional nutrition and functional medicine, you're looking at what's actually at the root of it. An example that I often give is, let's say you have a large tree in your backyard and it's beautiful and it provides a lot of shade and you love this tree, and the branches on it start dying. You aren't just going to start chopping off the dead branches. You're probably going to call an arborist and say, hey, what's going on with the tree? Is there a fungus? Are there ants? What's actually causing the branches on this tree to die, so that you can really nourish this tree at the roots and prevent the rest of the branches from falling off. And that's really what we're looking at when we talk about functional nutrition. How does the body all work together? Because even your digestive system, it's an open system and it's connected to all the other organs in your body, and it affects all the other systems in your body. So your endocrine system and even your HPA axis, etc. So we can't really treat these things in isolation, but unfortunately that's the model that our medical system runs off of is, oh, you have this issue, you go to this specialist, you have this issue, which there's a time and a place for that for sure. But if you have all these chronic symptoms, you really need to take a step back and look at how are they all connected.
I just imagine a giant whack-a-mole game, right? Like if you have these digestive symptoms, you're just constantly playing whack-a-mole, trying to find the quick fix or the dietary solution that will help you with the symptoms and get that relief. But I love the analogy of the roots of the tree and really finding like what is the root cause of these symptoms and how can we like work from the ground up to really get healing going. So for you, I know you mentioned sleep was an issue, over-exercise. Any other factors that you realized you had to focus on in order to reach that healing place?
Yeah. So there were a lot of things, and this was a slow process and this took time, but at the root of it, stress was a big one. And I'm not just talking about like feeling overwhelmed. I think a lot of times, people have been to the doctor and they're like, just calm down and that will fix your gut issues. But stress is so much more than just feeling overwhelmed. Your body is stressed because you're under eating, because you're overtraining, because you're not sleeping enough, because you're dehydrated, because you're stressed about food, because you're stressed about your symptoms. So we have to look at stress in a much larger lens than just, oh, your job is stressful, which could be the case, of course, but there's so many stressors on the body that play a role. So stress, of course, is the big one, and that's a huge bucket. The other thing was my good bacteria in my gut were completely wiped out because I'd been on so many elimination diets, even 10, 15 years ago, we knew so much less about the gut. So in some sense, part of the reason I struggled for so long is we didn't even really know about the gut-brain connection when I was in college. That was like very new emerging science. And so, maybe that's in the curriculum now, maybe it's not, I don't know. But the model for digestive health was, okay, just cut out the FODMAPs and then you'll avoid the bloating. And I remember actually being at this seminar. I was newly graduated and it was on GI. And I thought, okay, maybe this is what they didn't teach us in school. I'm so excited. I got there early. I was sitting in the front row and I was like, I'm ready to learn. And the lady for an hour proceeded to talk about all the foods that you couldn't eat if you had digestive issues. And I left there feeling so discouraged. Like, surely there has to be a better way. Like, I can't keep doing all these elimination diets because I have symptoms regardless of what I eat. So good bacteria completely wiped out as a result of all these elimination diets. My gut motility was really messed up, probably from stress, probably from past food poisoning. There's so many things that affect that. My stomach acid was low. I wasn't digesting food very well. And so the way that I like to explain GI issues to our clients is it all is a top-down process. A lot of times we focus on, what foods we shouldn't eat for our digestive symptoms, but the reality is there's so many steps of digestion before food ever even hits your intestines that if you're just focused on what food to avoid to prevent the bloating, you're missing like 10 different steps, and including the thoughts that you have about food. The second that you go into a stress response about food, it shuts down your salivation, which salivation is what actually triggers stomach acid production, pancreatic enzyme release, bile flow, all the things that we need to actually digest food. It shuts down gut motility, which is the movement of food and waste through your GI tract. So we can't just focus on food. We have to look at all the steps of digestion before food even ends up in your colon or your small intestine as well, and address those things. So for me, it was looking at all the upstream things, including my thyroid function was off. And actually at the time, I don't anymore, but had positive antibodies. So there's just a lot going on. And like I said, it was a step-by-step process, but a lot of that started with addressing the foundations, eating enough, getting enough sleep, drinking enough water, working on my thoughts about food. And then I started addressing some of these root causes like stomach acid, poor digestion, and all that.
Okay, so you're mentioning thoughts around food and the mind-gut connection. Could you please expand on that? Because I know everyone listening to this podcast has very stressful thoughts around food. Most of them have eating disorders. So I'd love to hear more about that through that lens.
Yeah. So on the topic of stress, your body is designed to prevent any stressful circumstances, right? So you are faced with a tiger, your body is thinking, let's run away from this tiger. The problem is that your body doesn't know the difference between an actual tiger and something else. For example, food. So if food is stressful for you and you're sitting down thinking, this is going to make me bloated, this food has too many calories, this has too much this, that, the other, immediately your body's thinking, there's a tiger sitting right next to me, and I'm not worried about digesting food. I am worried about running as fast as possible away from this tiger. And you don't need to digest a meal when you're running away. You need blood flow to your muscles so you can run as fast as possible. So blood flow is diverted away from the gut to your muscles, therefore impacting your digestion. So we often see that a lot of our clients have symptoms with food because of the stressful thoughts that they have about food and how that affects all the things that need to happen, as I mentioned previously, for digestion versus the food itself. But the problem is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? This is going to make me bloated. You go into a stress response, you eat the food, you get bloated, and then you're thinking, see, I knew it, this was going to make me bloated. And that's where a lot of people stay for a long period of time, and they don't think to, how can I approach this meal and reduce my stress? How can I optimize my digestion so that the foods don't cause the symptoms?
Wow. Okay. So I'm really curious, what are some of your tips or strategies for reducing stress around a meal and making sure those thoughts aren't causing that like flight or fight or freeze response?
Yeah. And just a caveat here, we're not trying to go from a negative thought to a positive thought. That's a lot of pressure. We're trying to go from a negative thought to a neutral thought. So instead of this food is going to make me bloated, my body has the ability to digest this food. Like just neutral, not like my body loves this broccoli or whatever it is. I don't know. That's not what we're trying to do. That's like toxic positivity. That's not the point. But what you can do is you can sit down and you can smell your food, and that stimulates that salivation, which stimulates that stomach acid production and pancreatic enzyme release and the whole digestive process. And you can take a couple deep breaths. There's research that shows even just 3 to 4 deep breaths reduces your stress response. So taking a couple deep breaths. This is something my family and I actually do before dinner, and my kids love it. So if you're listening to this thinking, I have young kids, this is impossible, I promise it's not. I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and it's possible. Doesn't mean the rest of the meal isn't stressful and I'm not running around trying to make sure people aren't throwing food at the wall, but like we at least start the meal in a less stressed state. So, if you pray, say a prayer or say a blessing, or just, say thanks for the food and take a couple deep breaths, and you can improve your stress response. Very, very simple. Another thing that kids love to do, so if you have young children, is humming happy birthday twice is a great way to stimulate your vagus nerve, which connects your gut and your brain and can help with that enzyme release and is going to help get you in that parasympathetic rest and digest state.
I love the idea of humming. I feel like that would put me in a good mood too.
Yeah, and you just think it's silly too. And especially if you have kids, they're going to love it. So
that's so smart. I think that's such a fun little tip. So I love that there are these little things that people can just start applying alongside of their meals to bring their stress response down, right? And calm themselves so that the meal can hopefully be digested with a little bit more ease. Yes. So I wanted to ask you also, what are some of the most common GI complaints that folks with eating disorders get or have?
Probably the most common is bloating. And the bloating isn't the actual root cause. Most of the time, individuals are bloated from being constipated. They could be bloated from having a low amount of good bacteria. As I mentioned earlier, that was the case with me. This is the case with a lot of people, especially if you've been under eating for a long period of time or restricting large food groups for a long period of time. Your gut bacteria actually digest fiber for you. So if you're the person that's like, I can't eat any carbohydrates, they make me bloated. Well, it's not actually the carbohydrates, it's the lack of bacteria to digest those carbohydrates. So bloating is a big one. Constipation is a big one. Acid reflux can also be a big one, typically triggered by constipation or low stomach acid, which is common. It's kind of a supply and demand issue. If you're under eating, your body kind of adapts to that. It's fixable, which is nice. And then diarrhea can be common. I would say that's less common, more common in an acute stressful situation. You have a busy day or a big meeting or something makes you nervous and you find yourself running to the bathroom. That can be common. But for the most part, I would say bloating, constipation, and acid reflux are the things we see.
Okay. So you're mentioning good gut bacteria. How does that get out of balance and how can people start to restore that balance within themselves?
So your gut bacteria, which if this is a new concept to you, newsflash, kind of crazy, you have 2 to 5 pounds of bacteria in and on your body, which is pretty wild to think about. You can't see these bacteria. They're very, very microscopic, but they do a lot of things for you. Like I said, they help you to digest your food. They also help with mental health, which I know is something that you wanted to talk about as well. But your good bacteria get diminished when you're under eating for a long period of time. These bacteria are really picky eaters. So when you're eating the same foods over and over again, your bacterial population gets starved because the foods that like oats are different than the foods that like green beans and nuts and whatever else. So you can naturally just shrink your microbiome because of the lack of diversity in your diet. You can also decrease diversity of your bacteria from stress, from not sleeping enough, from lack of sunlight exposure, from not being outside enough, which is pretty crazy. There's actually research that shows that kids who play in the dirt with pets have a more robust microbiome, but that's because there are microbes in the soil, which is pretty cool.
Wow, that is pretty cool. Okay, so essentially what I'm hearing is if someone's trying to restore the balance of good gut bacteria, there's a need for variety.
Yes, there's a need for variety, and it's not as simple as just taking a probiotic. What I don't want you to hear from this conversation is, oh, I need more bacteria in my gut. I'm just going to go to Whole Foods. I'm going to buy the most expensive probiotic and that will solve my issues. what you need is more plant diversity in your diet, more fibrous diversity. So the largest studies that we have on the gut show us that the more diversity of foods that you can eat, specifically plant foods that have fiber, the more diverse your gut bacteria is. And what we're looking at there is like 30 different plants a week, which sounds overwhelming, but it's really not, because so many things are plants: fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains, herbs, spices. So we're not just looking at eating 30 different fruits and vegetables. That would be really hard. But when you look at all the plants, there's so many ways that you can get diversity. And you're not going to go from eating 3 different things a week to eating 30. That's not going to feel very comfortable. You can go slow. Your gut is a muscle, and it can learn to tolerate these things over time. But also, if you're having a lot of trouble with this, that's where some of these other things could come into play. Maybe it's not just a gut bacterial issue. Maybe you do have slow gut motility, or poor digestion, or poor stomach acid, or all the things upstream that I was talking about earlier. So it's definitely important to, go slow, listen to your body. And if it's giving you cues that there could potentially be other things going on, it's worth exploring.
Okay. I think that's where it can get confusing, because it's like, is this an authentic GI issue, or is it a eating disorder, like a symptom of your eating disorder? Is there any way you can really like parse that out, or like, what are your recommendations for that?
Yeah, it can be hard. I always think that working with someone, if you can, is helpful, because they can help you determine this and look at patterns in your symptoms and help you determine, if there's other things going on. But for the most part, if it's just a restricted population of bacteria in your gut, and you're slowly introducing variety, and you're eating enough food and getting enough rest and addressing a lot of the foundations, the GI issues should resolve if there's nothing else going on. The problem is, for a lot of people, they don't, because there's other things that need to be addressed. So if you feel like you've got the basics, or you can't add foods in because the symptoms are so severe, that's also where maybe there could be other pieces to the puzzle.
Okay. Good to know. We're talking about introducing new foods in and more variety and establishing that good gut bacteria balance again. And could you explain how that process feels within a person, like what symptoms their bodies might go through? I imagine it can get quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, and that's why you want to go slow. As I was mentioning, like, don't go from eating 3 different plants a week to 30. That's not going to be comfortable. But it can be common to get a little bit more bloated when you start adding in different foods. Your body has to adjust to digesting those again, and your body needs to adjust to increase in volume. So you may feel more bloated. You may feel a little bit more discomfort, but it should subside, especially with consistency.
Okay. So you're thinking, or what you're saying is kind of sit with that discomfort and like know that, or almost expect that it's going to get a little bit of uncomfortable before you start to feel better again.
Yeah. And I mean, there's tons of tools that you can use to help the discomfort, whether it's peppermint tea or digestive bitters or abdominal massages or going on a walk or whatever it might be. There's lots of things that we can add in to help your body be more comfortable, so that you're not just sitting there in misery with your symptoms. That's not the goal.
I know. I love tea. I drink tea almost after every evening, just to help soothe my body, and it feels so much better. It helps my digestion. So I'm a big fan of that. But those other tips sounded really helpful too. What's your favorite? Do you have a go-to?
For digestive health, I really like fennel tea. I like nettles tea. I like ginger tea. Sometimes I make a blend. A lot of people like peppermint for gas relief, but one of the best teas for actually moving your bowels if you're constipated is ginger tea.
Wow. Okay. I did not know that. I actually had some ginger tea like recently and it was delicious. So I'm going to bring that more into my night routine. You also mentioned mental health. So I'd love to dive into that a little bit more. So could you explain that connection between gut health and mental health, and how addressing gut health can actually impact emotional well-being?
Totally. So the gut-brain connection is powerful. Your gut and your brain are connected by the largest cranial nerve, which is called the vagus nerve. And there's actually more signals going from your brain to your gut than your gut to your brain. So we talked a lot earlier about how stress impacts your digestion. And everyone is probably aware of some point in their life where stress has affected their digestion, whether they were nervous and they were running to the bathroom, or whether they were sad and their stomach was in knots, or whatever. Those are gut brain reactions. But the crazy part is that there's more output coming from your gut to your brain, meaning that there are specific bacteria in your gut that affect your brainwaves and that affect your mental health and even neuroinflammation. And so when your gut is healthy and when you have a good diversity of bacteria and you have good short chain fatty acid production from eating fiber and the process of fermentation in the gut, your brain is healthier. And I was actually at a dinner for a lab company last night, and they were talking actually about like specific probiotic strains that affect mental health. And the research is in some sense still fairly new, but it's becoming more robust by the day, honestly, because it's such a hot topic and it's something that so many people are using and so interested in, because you really can't ignore the connection, and again, it's not as simple as taking a probiotic to affect your mental health. There are specific probiotics that certainly can help, but we want to look at it, as far as the whole picture. How's your digestion? What do your LPS levels look like? Are your intestines permeable, et cetera, which that's probably a bit more of the biochemistry that we don't want to get into on this episode, but there's a lot of tools that we can use to improve your gut health, to improve your mental health.
So when you improve your gut health on a almost biological or chemical level, there increase in mood.
Yes. And there's specific gut bacteria that produce neurotransmitters like serotonin, which is a big one in the mental health space. So there are things that we can do to optimize neurotransmitter production, your brain waves, et cetera, via your gut, which is pretty cool.
Wow, that is really cool. That it's almost a little bit hopeful, right? It's like more motivation for people recovering from an eating disorder or anyone who's struggling with gut health to like find that root cause and really bring healing. And so for so many listeners, it's about the motivation to actually eat more with more variety.
Totally.
Wow, so interesting. Do you have any stories of clients or folks you have worked with who have undergone a transformation with their gut healing, either physically or mentally, and what that was like for them?
Yeah, we actually have one right now that's pretty cool. So we have this client who she's a nurse and she has dealt with on and off eating disorder for a long time. And most recently struggled with orthorexia, she believes largely due to her digestive issues. She had been to a lot of other alternative doctors who had told her, like, you need to be on this restrictive diet, you need to be on that restrictive diet, whatever, to address your symptoms. She had terrible gastritis, which if you've never had gastritis, it's very, very uncomfortable. It feels like your insides are on fire, and tons of acid reflux, tons of bloating, constipation, etc. She was only eating a small handful of foods. She was severely underweight, and she had gone to treatment, but the problem is she'd go to treatment and they weren't addressing her gut issues. They were just addressing her eating disorder. And she had to leave AMA the last time because her gastritis was so bad. And she's like, I have to do something else. So on a whim, she reached out to me and she actually started working with us in our program. And it's been pretty miraculous. Not only has she restored her weight, but she's expanded the variety of foods that she's eating. Her bloating has gone away. The gastritis symptoms have gone away. She hasn't had like another test to see kind of on the spectrum where she's at, but she doesn't have any acid reflux symptoms anymore. And she was considering previously ditching out on nursing because she's like, I can't do these 12-hour shifts with these terrible symptoms. And so now she's thriving, in her career and going out to eat. She sent us a picture the other day from the Cheesecake Factory with her family. And that's
Wow.
not a single story. I could tell hundreds of stories like that, but it just, in the eyes of even like an eating disorder treatment center, she would have been seen as a failure, and she wasn't. She truly was so miserable with her GI symptoms and unfortunately wasn't getting the support that she needed on the GI side of things, which sadly happens a lot. And we see a lot of clients like that. And so I'm not saying that to bash any treatment center or anything, but what I am saying this to say is trust your gut, not to sound cheesy. Also, like, there's a world in which we can work together. There's a world in which you can address your eating disorder and you can also not be miserable with digestive symptoms.
Wow. So when someone comes to you like very restricted, eating minimally, maybe even more orthorexia tendencies, like how do you typically begin? Like what would that look like?
Yeah. So for everyone, it's going to be a little bit different. With her, obviously we did our standard assessment and medical history and looking at patterns in her symptoms and, kind of her whole story. Where did this all start? She already had a lot of tests. So looked at a lot of the blood work and other tests that she'd had. We actually ran a stool test on her as well to see what was going on in her gut, which was pretty impactful. She had one, I think, 2 years prior, but I mean, super outdated, not very great information 2 years later. So we reran one and got an update on that. And that's where we started looking at, okay, what does your medical history show? What are the day-to-day patterns show us? What do the test results show? And what is all of this pointing to as far as what your root causes are? So we always start from the top. How are we going to improve the thoughts about food, meal hygiene, and eating environment? How are we going to add to make sure she's meeting her caloric needs? And then how are we also going to manage the symptoms? We don't want to manage the symptoms forever, but in the beginning, we need to manage the symptoms to make sure she can eat enough. And then once she is, okay, now how do we address some of these underlying things like the gastritis, like the other things that showed up on her stool test? So quite a process, but first starting with looking and assessing what's going on, managing the symptoms, and then addressing these root causes that we've determined.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a long process, but very promising because it's taking a look at the whole picture, probably for the first time ever for so many folks.
Yeah, and it sounds long, but I mean, this is a client and she's just coming up on 6 months with working with us, which in the grand scheme of her story is really not that long. So, people can spend 6 months and all of a sudden look back and that goes by in a blink. So it's really short in the span of everything.
Yeah, 6 months is actually a pretty short time period to find healing from a lifetime of struggling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what advice do you have for folks who are, experiencing like maybe a painful or disheartening experience with the meal? Like maybe they've been told by their dietitian or some sort of gut health expert, hey, like try to incorporate these foods, but the symptoms are coming up, they're feeling uncomfortable and they're feeling disheartened. Like what tips do you have or advice for them to stay motivated? Because it's got to be super hard.
It is. It's super hard. And the first thing I would say is it's not always going to be like this. Like one thing that we encourage our clients to do is like, let's make decisions based on how we want life to be 1 to 3 years from now, not how we want life to be today. So what can you choose today to make life better 1 to 3 years from now? So even though it might be the hard choice of expanding variety or, eating more or whatever it might be, like, where do you want to be? And also kind of on the opposite side of that, it's okay to advocate for yourself as well. Just like the story that I shared, if you're not getting the answers that you want and you're not getting the help that you want, it's okay to ask for what you need, potentially seek other help, or just tell people the type of help that you. I think a lot of times, kind of similar to my story as well, I thought for so long my symptoms were just normal and I had to live with them and it had to be this way, but it doesn't have to be. There's a way in which you can recover and you can also not feel miserable. So getting everybody on the same page, getting the help that you need, and making sure that you have the tools that you need to manage the symptoms as well.
That is such a helpful reminder, especially for folks in, the recovery community. I think sometimes people tend to convince themselves that their issues aren't worth fighting for, or maybe they're not significant enough. So I love that kind of cheesy phrase you said, trust your gut and have the ability to speak up for yourself if you feel like what's going on with your current treatment isn't working.
Totally.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, so what are the final words of wisdom do you have for folks with digestive issues in recovery?
Final words of wisdom. I think it would be what I said earlier. Trust your gut, get the support that you need, and make decisions today based on how you want life to be in the future. And don't choose the temporary comfort over long-term discomfort.
So powerful. I always try to remind my clients and listeners the power of delayed gratification in recovery. You're always working towards honoring your future self and supporting your future self. It sounds like you are right there with me on that.
Totally.
Well, Heather, this has been so enlightening and helpful and educational, and I really appreciate it. And I'm just curious, how can listeners who have really connected with what you're saying today reach out to you or find you in case they'd like to work with you?
Yeah. So the best way to find me is on Instagram. It's at Dr. Heather Finley. And if you want more just tips, tools, resources, I actually have a really fun quiz. The quiz will actually help you determine what your potential root causes are, but it's also really fun because it will connect your root causes to a popular song. So you'll get to see if you're Evanescence or Miley Cyrus or Justin Timberlake. So you can just go to drheatherfinley.co/quiz and I can send you that link so you can put it in the show notes.
Wow, that sounds so fun. I love a good quiz and I love music. So I hope everyone takes advantage of that little fun, almost tool/distraction at the same time. So
yes.
Awesome. Well, we'll be adding that to the show notes for sure and all the links so everyone can come find you. Heather, thank you so much again. This was such a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
You're very welcome. All right, that concludes this week's episode of the Full and Thriving podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode of the show. When you have a moment, please head on over to Instagram and follow my recovery coaching account at Meg_McCabe to stay up to date on everything I'm doing in recovery land. And if you're feeling extra inspired, please send me a direct message to let me know how this podcast has impacted your life. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.